At 7:02 a.m. on December 12, 1944, Sergeant Frank Kovacs wasn't praying for God's help. He was praying for the structural integrity of Manila rope. Kovacs was the commander and primary engineer of an M4A3E2 Sherman jumbo tank, codenamed Kingfisher, and they were stalled on the lip of a shallow but treacherous ravine. Below them, 40 feet down, lay the frozen, churned mud that marked the approach to the Saar River in Germany. The air thrummed with the sound of incoming German artillery, a desperate final bombardment, meant to break the American advance before they could secure the river crossing. Shrapnel hissed past the thick vertical slab armor of the jumbo, but the greater, more immediate danger wasn't German steel. It was the terrain. The ground was a grotesque mixture of clay, ice, shattered stone, and liquid mud, a geological nightmare designed to swallow heavy machinery. 3 standard Sherman tanks had already attempted this specific traverse in the last 90 minutes. All 3 were now immobilized, tilted precariously, or already abandoned, earning the position, the designation, the graveyard slope. Kovacs, a man who saw military regulations as suggestions and gravity as a personal challenge, peered through the periscope. His crew, 3 men who had also been deemed disruptive misfits by standard Army protocol, waited for the verdict. Their only remaining option involved a radical modification, one that, if it failed, would not only shred the tank's tracks, but leave them immobilized and exposed to the German Panzerfaust teams already rumored to be moving up the valley floor. Frank Kovacs, 28 years old, was the leader of the 511th Provisional Tank Detachment, better known throughout the Third Army as the Junkyard Dogs. The 511th was not a designation found in any formal TO&E, Table of Organization and Equipment. It was an accidental unit, a dumping ground created in the English countryside months earlier for every mechanical genius, unauthorized modifier, and technical specialist who couldn't conform to the rigid discipline of the armored divisions. The standard Army doctrine saw these men as problems. They stole parts, they ignored manuals, and they questioned every order. But Major Elias Thorne, a beleaguered ordnance officer tasked with recovering disabled armor, saw them differently. Thorne saw necessity. "You take the rejects, Kovacs," Thorne had told him, "the guys who can fix anything with baling wire and spite. You keep them running, no matter what it takes. Forget the manual. Your new manual is whether the solution works, and if you survive to talk about it." The Junkyard Dogs embraced this mandate. They drove tanks that looked cobbled together and often smelled faintly of illicit diesel and moonshine. The Kingfisher itself was a testament to their ethos. Officially designated a Sherman jumbo for its significantly thicker armor, Kovacs and his crew had added even more non-standard plating scavenged from abandoned German half-tracks and welded crudely onto the glacis plate. They had modified the main gun stabilizer with parts from a disassembled civilian tractor, and most importantly, they had constantly fought the mud. The deep mud of the late fall campaign in France and the early winter push into Germany had been the single greatest threat to Allied armor. The standard T-54 track shoe on the Sherman was designed for traction, but not for the sheer sucking power of European clay. Time and again, Kovacs watched Shermans bog down, their tracks spinning uselessly, acting more like giant, ineffective rolling pins than gripping treads. Kovacs had dedicated the previous 3 weeks to solving the problem of zero-traction terrain. His solution was simple, brutal, and completely non-regulation. It was the Manila rope in the storage baskets fastened to the rear of the Kingfisher baskets that the quartermaster insisted should be used for personal effects and emergency rations. Kovacs stored industrial lengths of thick hemp, Manila rope originally intended for ship mooring. The idea was simple. During a period of high risk, they could manually wrap sections of the rope around the existing track assemblies, crossing the steel grousers diagonally. This process created an improvised, heavily abrasive latticework. It provided grip where none existed, essentially turning the smooth steel track shoe into a clawed appendage capable of grabbing at the ice and resisting the suction of the mud. The risk was immense. If the rope tangled, snapped, or stretched unevenly, it could pull the track right off the boogie wheels. A catastrophic track throw in the middle of a firefight, rendering the 33-ton vehicle a stationary target. Standard combat protocol demanded that no crew ever risk modifying the primary propulsion system in such an extreme manner. But standard protocol was irrelevant now. Kovacs looked down at the mud where the 3 other Shermans lay silent. They were supposed to secure the crossing point by 7:30 a.m. It was 7:06 a.m. now. Radio check. Kovacs barked into the intercom. Gunner Private First Class Benny the Switch, Malone replied. Clear, Sarge. Command says hold position. Wait for engineers. Negative, Malone, Kovacs replied, his voice calm despite the increasing whistle of mortar landing 200 yards away. If we wait for engineers, we wait until dark. And by dark, Jerry will have this slope zeroed in. We have 3 vehicles stuck below us. We need to go now. He unlatched the turret hatch, drawing the immediate, intense attention of his crew. Driver, pull us back 20 yards. We need flat ground to work. We are doing the rope modification. And we're doing it on both sides. Move it. The immediate danger of the German bombardment faded slightly, replaced by the white-knuckle terror of self-inflicted disaster. To leave the relative safety of the tank to secure the rope tracks was suicide by exposure. To rely on the rope to hold meant trusting a Detroit mechanic's dangerous. Gamble with the lives of 4 men and $50,000 worth of combat machinery. But Sergeant Kovacs, the chief junkyard dog, understood the equation perfectly. Sometimes the only way to survive the impossible was to engineer a solution that the manuals forbade. Kingfisher ground its way, backward churning shallow divots into the soft ground 20 yards above the slope. It was 7:07 a.m. The move, though slight, drew unwelcome attention. A heavy German MG-42, positioned somewhere on the far side of the Saar Valley, opened up a brief exploratory burst, the round splattering against the thick side skirts of the M4A3E2 like hailstones. Sergeant Kovacs threw open his hatch. The stench of frozen earth and burning cordite hit him instantly. Rigetti. Let's go, port side first. Malone, keep your eyes on that ridgeline. 10 o'clock. Suppress anything that twitches. Corporal Tommy Rigetti, the tank's loader and the second half of the Junkyard Dogs core mechanical duo, scrambled out, carrying a coil of oil-soaked manila rope nearly as thick as his arm. Rigetti, a wiry man from rural Pennsylvania, had been court-martialed 3 times for stealing specialized tools, which was exactly why Kovacs trusted him implicitly with high-stakes improvisations. He knew how metal and fiber behaved under stress. The standard procedure for throwing a track took 2 trained mechanics over an hour under ideal conditions. To wrap a track under fire with non-standard material was madness. Kovacs calculated they had less than 10 minutes before the German spotters relayed their exact position to the heavy mortar that were already harassing the valley dot. They worked in a frantic, brutal rhythm. The rope, pre-cut into 30-foot lengths, was stiff and cold, resisting their pull. The goal was to thread the rope through the gaps in the T-54 track grousers, looping it around the main body of the track and securing the ends with heavy-duty steel clamps scavenged from the undercarriage of a wrecked German Tiger tank weeks prior. Kovacs' hands were freezing within 2 minutes, but the adrenaline burned hot. He was working directly above the running gear, mere inches from the steel treads that, if accidentally engaged, would instantly sever the rope and likely a limb dot at 7:10 a.m. The danger escalated dramatically. The single MG-42 burst grew into sustained fire, joined by a lighter MG-34. The Germans had confirmed the position of the exposed American armor crew. Rounds hammered around them. The heavy armor that protected the crew inside was now merely a noisy, useless wall beside them. "Cover fire, Malone, now." Kovacs yelled, not looking up. Inside, Private First Class Malone complied instantly. The M4A3E2's coaxially mounted .30 caliber machine gun roared to life, spitting a continuous stream of tracer rounds toward the German positions, forcing the enemy gunners to duck. The deafening sound of the machine gun, coupled with the incoming ricochets, turned the exterior of the Kingfisher into a temporary hellscape of noise and flying debris. Rigetti wrestled with the final clamp on the port side. He secured the thick rope into the heavy steel mechanism, ratcheting the bolt down tight with a stolen wrench, ensuring the improvised track reinforcement would not vibrate loose under the tremendous torque of the engine. "Port side secured, Sarge." Rigetti shouted at 7:12 a.m., his breath fogging violently in the cold air. They sprinted around to the starboard side, the danger compounded by the fact that they now had to cross the machine gun's line of fire to reach the other track. Kovacs moved with the economical movements of a man who understood how little space separated survival from instant vaporization. He was focused solely on the geometry of the track and the friction points of the rope. The starboard side went faster, the fear injecting speed into their muscles. They finished the securing process at 7:15 a.m. The resulting track assembly looked barbaric. The steel treads were now encased in a rough, mud-defying weave of hemp and metal. It looked less like official U.S. Army equipment and more like something cobbled together in a desert workshop, exactly as the Junkyard Dogs intended. "We are done," Kovacs rasped, scrambling back into the protection of the turret. Rigetti slammed the loader's hatch seconds later. The collective relief was immediate, but short-lived. They were still stalled, and the German artillery was now bracketing their position, zeroing in with unnerving accuracy. The hull groaned as a 75mm shell impacted 50 yards to their left. "Gunner, prepare to fire he when we hit the bottom of the slope. Driver, start your engine. We are going down in 30 seconds, Kovacs ordered. He pressed the intercom button to the driver, Private Miles Dusty Rhodes, a former stock car mechanic who possessed a reckless disregard for traction limits. "Rhodes, listen up. This is not regulation. We are relying on rope. Maintain minimum speed. If you feel slippage, do not power through. We need to walk this thing down the slope, or we throw both tracks and join the graveyard." Rhodes simply acknowledged the impossible order with a clipped, professional response. "Roger that, Kingfisher." Walking it down, Kovacs drew a sharp breath. The next few minutes would prove whether his engineering rebellion was genius or suicide. He knew that the moment they committed to the slope, they would be entering the kill zone, moving toward a river crossing that the German commanders had every intention of turning into a massacre. It was 7:16 a.m., and the Kingfisher began its agonizing descent toward the treacherous mud. The Kingfisher, heavy with its reinforced armor and the added weight of the improvised track rigging, began to move. The 40-foot slope, steep and rutted, was a deadly combination of loose shale and frozen ice. Driver Dusty Rhodes engaged the transmission with a delicate touch, easing the 33 tons forward. At 7:17 a.m., the front boogie wheels hit the lip of the ravine. The immediate difference made by the Manila rope was astonishing. Instead of the telltale high-pitched whine of steel tracks skidding uselessly on ice, the sound that had sealed the fate of the previous 3 Shermans, there was a lower, guttural chewing noise. The thick hemp ropes dug into the frozen ground like crude claws, finding purchase where the smooth metal grousers failed. The tank moved slowly, at perhaps 2 miles per hour, its hull tilted at a terrifying 20-degree angle. Every ounce of concentration was fixed on the sound of the tracks. If the tempo changed, if the rhythmic bite of the rope faltered, it meant they were about to slip. Inside the turret, Kovacs was braced against the vibrations, his eyes glued to the periscope. Visibility was poor, the light still weak, filtered through the smoke of continuous shell bursts. He could see the wrecks of the other tanks below. A Sherman M4A1, half buried on its side, and two others sitting upright, but completely immobilized, their crews long gone, having abandoned the useless steel coffins. As the Kingfisher descended into the valley floor, the German defensive fire intensified. The Germans, recognizing the brazen advance of the single heavy tank, shifted their focus from general harassment to surgical elimination. Incoming, 11 o'clock. Malone yelled, spotting the muzzle flash of a hidden Pak-40 anti-tank gun positioned in the tree line, approximately 800 yards across the valley. Kovacs didn't hesitate. Malone, he. Get that Pak. The turret whined as Malone traversed the 76mm main gun. Targeting was near impossible. The ravine was designed to obscure vision, and the tank was still moving and shaking violently. Fire! At 7:19 a.m., the main gun roared, a deep concussive blast that momentarily drowned out the exterior chaos. The high explosive shell screamed across the valley. It impacted too close for the Germans, but not close enough to neutralize the gun. A plume of black smoke and splintered wood erupted 20 feet short of the target. Seconds later, the Pak-40 retaliated. A deafening clang rattled the Kingfisher. The entire tank lurched violently, and a shower of superheated spall fragments sprayed into the fighting compartment. Report! Kovacs yelled, fighting the ringing in his ears. Driver's hatch took a hit. Rhodes reported immediately, his voice tight but stable. Armor held. F was a 75, Sergeant. They know we're coming. The shell had struck the improvised armor plating Kovacs had personally welded onto the upper glacis, the scavenger plates stolen from a knocked-out German tank. It was a perfect demonstration of the Junkyard Dog philosophy. Standard armor would have resisted, but the extra reinforcement had absorbed and scattered the kinetic energy, possibly saving Rhodes from a debilitating injury or worse. But they were still exposed. They were halfway down the slope and heading directly into the mud pit, the graveyard where the other tanks had met their fate. Kovacs shifted his attention to the ground outside the periscope view. The rope tracks were holding. They were grabbing at the mud and ice, kicking up chunks of earth, but maintaining forward momentum. It was a high-wire act of mechanical defiance. At 7:21 a.m., the Kingfisher reached the bottom of the slope. The moment they hit the valley floor, the ground turned instantly viscous. It was not firm. It was a churning, sucking mire, a quarter-mile stretch of hell separating them from the slightly firmer ground near the riverbank. Hold steady, Rhodes. Maintain the walk. Don't let the tension slack, Kovacs ordered, recognizing the critical moment. The engine labored under the immense resistance. The track tension screamed a high-pitched protest against the forces attempting to tear the tank apart. They were moving at the pace of a slow walk, but they were moving. The Pak-40 fired again. This time, the German gunner had corrected his aim. Incoming! The round struck the Kingfisher mid-hull, directly on the fuel tank compartment, just behind the track skirts. The shell, though non-penetrating due to the thickness of the Jumbo's side armor, delivered a colossal shockwave. The force of the impact momentarily stalled the tank's engine. The worst-case scenario had arrived, immobile, exposed, and now sitting directly in the thickest part of the mud, just 500 yards from the enemy. The silence of the stalled engine was the loudest sound Kovacs had ever heard. Engine restart, Rhodes? Now, we are sitting ducks. 7:22 a.m. The heart of the Kingfisher, a massive Ford GAAV-8 engine, was silent. The impact of the anti-tank round, while failing to breach the armor, had jarred the electrical systems, killing the spark. Stalled 500 yards from the river and 800 yards from the Pak-40, they were now a stationary target of exceptional value to the Germans. The sound of the valley, moments before dominated by the laboring engine, was now filled only with the chilling, close-range sounds of war, the chatter of the MG-42 and the ominous thump-thump of advancing mortar fire. "Rhodes! Status! What's the damage?" Kovacs demanded, his hand gripping the emergency fire suppression handle. "I think the magneto took a shock, Sarge. Trying to reset the primary ignition circuit." Dusty Rhodes wrestled frantically with the controls in the cramped driver's compartment. The smell of burning insulation was beginning to mix with the metallic scent of the interior. Kovacs knew they had maybe 60 seconds before the German gunners, seeing the tank halt, could correct their aim and place a killing shot. A static Sherman tank, even a jumbo, was vulnerable to repeated precise anti-tank fire aimed at weak points, such as the track assemblies or the joint between the hull and the turret. Malone, load armor-piercing high-explosive PHE. Keep that 11 o'clock covered. Righetti, check the radio. Demand air cover, anything. Righetti slammed his fist onto the standard SCR-508 radio set. "Static, Sarge." The hit must have fried the antenna coupling. "We are running dark." The situation had devolved from dangerous to catastrophic. Immobile, radio silent. Trapped in a quagmire designed to kill armor. Kovacs pressed his eye back to the periscope. He could see German infantry activity, increasing on the far bank, small, dark shapes moving rapidly toward the river. They weren't just securing the position. They were preparing a counterattack. The stalled Kingfisher was the centerpiece of their defense. A fresh barrage of 81mm mortar began impacting the mud directly around the tank. The explosions were muffled by the earth, but the spray of mud and water slammed the tank with incredible force. "Rhodes, status on that engine." "We're taking mortar hits." "Trying, Sergeant. It's fighting me." Kovacs considered his options, the impossible decisions that defined the Junkyard Dogs. Dilemma 1. Option A. Abandon the tank. Retreat on foot, taking the main gun breech block and vital optics to prevent capture. Standard doctrine. Consequence: the mission to secure the river crossing fails immediately, and the 3 Shermans below them remain trapped. 2. Option B. Stay and fight. Use the machine guns and hope Rhodes can get the engine started before the anti-tank gun finds a weak spot. High risk of immediate death. Kovacs rejected option A. They hadn't come this far, modified the tank, and risked their necks in the open just to abandon the machine at the critical moment. Rhodes bypassed the primary. "Go manual start. We need ignition now," Kovacs shouted. Rhodes was already working on the emergency bypass, trying to force the enormous engine to cough back to life. Meanwhile, Malone maintained the fire discipline. He held the 8th round ready, waiting for the precise moment the PaK-40 showed itself again. The German gunners were proving patient, waiting for the mortar fire to fully suppress the American response. Then, the critical detail emerged: the tracks. Kovacs focused the periscope down toward the ground. The Kingfisher was sinking slowly but steadily into the deep, viscous mud, but the Manila rope held. The ingenious modification was now their anchor. The friction provided by the rope segments acted like stabilizers, preventing the tank from tilting or sliding uncontrollably deeper into the mire. If they had been running standard tracks, the tank would have already slipped sideways or sunk to the point of no recovery, regardless of the engine status. The rope was the only thing preventing the mechanical collapse of the vehicle in the quicksand-like mud. The rope is holding, even if the engine isn't. At 7:25 a.m., with a violent, agonizing tremor, the 4G AAV-8 roared back to life. A cloud of black exhaust smoke billowed from the rear deck. "We have power, Sarge. Running hot." Rhodes shouted, his relief palpable. Kovacs felt a surge of adrenaline. "All right, Rhodes. Don't stop moving. Steady, walking pace. We have to cross this quagmire. Malone, the PaK is waiting for us to expose ourselves. We are going to give them a target, then obliterate them." The Kingfisher began to churn forward again. The immediate danger of the German gunner spotting the movement forced Kovacs into the second major tactical dilemma of the mission. They needed to cross the mud pit, but to do so, they needed to move in a straight line, directly exposing their front armor to the Pak-40. Kovacs prepared for the ultimate gamble. 7:26 a.m. The Kingfisher moved forward, the sounds of the engine and the rope tracks crushing the mud, a defiant roar in the valley. They were making progress, perhaps 30 feet in the first minute, slowly closing the distance to the river. Kovacs knew the German Pak-40 crew was calculating trajectory, waiting for the tank to reach a point of greater exposure or slow down again. He decided to turn the Kingfisher's primary weakness, its slow movement in the mud, into a deceptive tactical advantage. "Roads, I want a momentary turn, then straighten out. Right 5 degrees, then back to center. Make it look like we're struggling to maintain bearing." The purpose of the feint was twofold: to test the rope tracks under lateral stress, and to bait the German gunner into firing early. If the Pak-40 fired while they were still in the deep mud, it would be difficult for the German crew to correct their aiming point quickly enough for a second decisive shot. Rhodes executed the maneuver flawlessly. The Kingfisher veered slightly, and the weight shifted heavily. A terrifying groan echoed through the hull, but the Manila rope held the track assembly together, preventing slippage and a catastrophic throw. At 7:27 a.m., the ruse worked. The Pak-40 fired. The shells streaked across the valley, aimed at where the German gunner calculated the center of the tank would be based on the apparent struggle. But because of the slow, deliberate movement, the round impacted the ground just 5 yards ahead of the Kingfisher, exploding with a massive force that threw mud and debris over the tank's front slope. He missed. Malone, "Fire now." "The gun is exposed," Kovacs screamed. The 76mm main gun roared. Malone, who had been locked onto the observed muzzle flash, put the eighth round precisely where the German gun had briefly exposed its crew for reloading. The impact was devastating. The eighth shell, designed to penetrate and then explode, slammed directly into the shield of the Pak-40. The secondary explosion engulfed the gun position in fire and smoke. Direct hit. Pak-40 neutralized, Malone confirmed triumphantly. A fraction of the danger was eliminated, but the infantry threat remained, and the Kingfisher was still navigating the quagmire. They had roughly 200 yards left of deep mud before reaching the edge of the Saar River. Kovacs spotted them instantly. 3 German skirmishers, Panzerfaust anti-tank teams, emerging from the tree line, approximately 150 yards to their front, moving fast and low, taking advantage of the smoke and chaos. Their target was the tank's side armor, which, though thicker than a standard Sherman's, was vulnerable to the powerful shaped charge warheads of the disposable launchers. Infantry contact. 3 targets, front and 2 o'clock. They have Panzerfausts. Malone switched to coaxial MG. Fire short bursts. Rigetti, prepare to use the bow machine gun. The Kingfisher now became a mobile pillbox fighting for its life. The coaxial machine gun thrashed, stitching lines of fire into the ground near the advancing teams. Rigetti, utilizing the hull-mounted 30 caliber, usually a difficult weapon to aim with precision, poured fire into the German line of advance, forcing 2 of the enemy soldiers to scatter into the undergrowth. But one German soldier, driven by desperation, kept running. He was aiming for a depression in the terrain, 80 yards away, that would give him the perfect flanking shot on the Kingfisher as unreinforced rear flank. This was the point of highest exposure. The tank was moving too slowly to evade. "Roads, maximum speed now. We need to break the mud," Kovacs commanded, knowing the request was insane. Maximum speed would surely throw the improvised rope tracks. Rhodes didn't argue. He pushed the throttle forward. The Ford V8 shrieked, delivering its maximum torque to the drive sprockets. The tension on the Manila ropes was immense. The tracks spun for a sickening second, throwing massive clods of mud high into the air. But then the rope caught purchase. The friction was so great it briefly smoked. The Kingfisher surged forward violently, accelerating to nearly 5 miles per hour fast enough to cover the remaining distance to the riverbank in under 2 minutes if the tracks held. It was 7:30 a.m., the exact time the objective was supposed to be secured. At the very limit of their trajectory, the rogue German infantryman rose from the depression, leveled his Panzerfaust 60, and fired. The sound of the rocket motor was distinct and terrifying. Kovacs saw the projectile streaking toward them through the periscope. It was aimed directly at the track assembly, seeking to immobilize the tank and tear the tracks off the running gear. Want to know if Kovacs and the Kingfisher survived the impact and if the rope tracks held against a direct anti-tank hit? Hit that like button right now. It tells the algorithm this story matters and helps more people discover it. Subscribe for more untold World War II stories. Back to Sergeant Kovacs and the Kingfisher. 7:31 a.m. The Panzerfaust 60 round impacted the Kingfisher's port side with a localized explosive roar. The shaped charge was designed to penetrate thick armor, and the impact point was dangerously close to the side sponson, just above the rear boogie wheels. However, the rope track modification provided an unexpected fleeting layer of defense. The blast detonated on contact with the thick, oil-soaked Manila rope. The hemp fibers, combined with the steel clamps and the heavy track grousers, created a rudimentary form of spaced armor. The explosion was slightly muffled and dispersed, preventing the focus jet of molten metal from achieving full penetration on the thick side armor of the jumbo. Inside the tank, the impact felt like being struck by a sledgehammer. The whole vehicle shuddered violently, and the interior lights momentarily flickered out. Track damage report. Rigetti, check the drive wheel. Kovacs shouted immediately. Rhodes, fighting the steering, reported, "Heavy vibration on the port side, Sarge. Loss of tension. The tracks are slipping." The Panzerfaust hadn't penetrated the hull, but it had succeeded in its primary function. It had destroyed the improvised track reinforcement. The Manila rope on the port side was instantly vaporized or shredded, and the heavy clamps were gone. Worse, the blast had likely damaged some of the track teeth and possibly warped a section of the track shoe. The Kingfisher was now running on one improvised, functional track, starboard, and one damaged standard track, port. The resulting uneven traction was immediately apparent. The tank began to yaw violently to the left, threatening to spin out of control or worse, throw the remaining good track due to the uneven torque distribution. Hold that wheel, Rhodes. Use the brake. Countersteer right. Don't let us turn sideways. Kovacs commanded, his voice strained with urgency. If the tank rotated and presented its less armored rear deck to the Germans, they were finished. Rhodes wrestled with the controls, maintaining a precarious forward momentum by constantly feathering the port side brake, compensating for the destroyed traction. Malone didn't wait for orders. Seeing the shooter and the smoke, he traversed the 76mm main gun and fired a high explosive round at the area where the infantryman had fired from. The shell cleared the German position, neutralizing the last immediate threat from the Panzerfaust team. The clock read 7:33 a.m. They had traveled perhaps 100 more yards. The ground was slowly firming up as they approached the river's edge, but the damage was done. The Kingfisher was running wounded. Kovacs had to make a tactical decision based on a critical engineering assessment. They could not maintain this speed and uneven balance for long. The starboard track, still wrapped in the smoking Manila rope, was carrying an unsustainable load. He spotted the 3-stranded Shermans about 40 yards to his right. They were dead weight, but they were also solid steel platforms. Rhodes, change of direction. "We're moving to the wrecks," Kovacs ordered. "Sarge? Why?" "We need to secure the riverbank." Rigetti questioned over the intercom. "We can't fight effectively and crawl across this ground, Rigetti. We're wounded. We need to stabilize our position before we can secure the crossing. 7:38 a.m. The valley floor remained a hazardous blend of smoke and fear, but the immediate threat was neutralized. The silence of the Pack 40 and the dispersion of the Panzerfaust teams bought Sergeant Kovacs and Corporal Rigetti a narrow window, perhaps 15 minutes before the Germans regrouped or called in dedicated heavy fire. Kovacs was the first man out, carrying his M1 carbine and moving with calculated paranoia. Rigetti followed, burdened by an oxygen-acetylene cutting torch kit and a heavy tool bag. Their objective was the nearest wreck, the M4A1, which was serving as their current shield. Malone, keep your eyes on the far bank. Anything that moves, suppress it. Roads, maintain engine idle. Be ready to pivot if we take flank fire. The maintenance manual specified track repair should be performed in a secure rear area maintenance depot. What Kovacs intended to do field repairing a primary track assembly under combat conditions, using scavenged parts, was pure Junkyard Dog engineering. Kovacs assessed the Kingfisher's port track. The Panzerfaust blast had focused its energy on the track shoe assembly, ripping off the last 15 feet of the rope reinforcement and visibly buckling 3 track pads. One segment of the track was slightly deformed, and running the tank for long would result in a guaranteed track throw. The solution lay in the wrecks. Standard Shermans utilized the same track type T-54, and the 3 immobilized tanks were essentially full-scale parts depots. Rigetti immediately went to work on the closest wreck, the M4A1. The turret hatch was open, a dark testament to the crew's hasty departure. The task was brutal. They needed to remove an intact segment of track, at least 5 pads from the immobilized tank, and transfer them to the Kingfisher. Removing a section of track required driving out the track pins, a process that demanded high force and careful alignment. Under normal conditions, they used specialized track jack equipment. Here, they had a sledgehammer and their own brute strength. At 7:41 a.m., Rigetti positioned the cutting torch. Instead of struggling with the jammed pins, Kovacs made the tactical decision to destroy the old tank's damaged sections with fire. Cut the track in 3 places. Around the damaged section, Rigetti. We're not doing this neatly. We just need the good segment free. The acetylene torch roared to life, a blinding, white-hot jet in the murky morning light. Sparks flew violently as the flame sliced through the heavy steel of the track shoes. The sound was distinct and loud, a metallic shriek that echoed across the valley, signaling to every German soldier within earshot exactly where the Americans were and that they were attempting repairs. The Germans responded instantly. A fresh fusillade of MG fire poured in from across the river, focusing on the area where the blinding light of the torch shone. The bullets impacted the shielded Kingfisher and the wreck they were scavenging from, forcing Kovacs and Rigetti to duck for cover behind the massive, lifeless bulk of the M4A1. Malone hit them. Full auto. Keep their heads down. Malone obeyed, pouring fire toward the riverbank, giving the 2 mechanics just enough cover to continue their dangerous task. Rigetti finished the first cut, then the second. The 5-pad section, weighing hundreds of pounds, was now free but incredibly hot. They had to handle it using thick gloves and pure momentum. At 7:45 a.m., they had the replacement track segment. Now came the precise part, threading the replacement segment onto the Kingfisher's damaged track and aligning the pins. The mud made working under the tank almost impossible, forcing them to crouch precariously, using flashlights to illuminate the tight space. Kovacs directed the process, his military rank temporarily replaced by his engineering authority. He leveraged a heavy pry bar to align the pin holes a fraction of an inch off, and the pin would bind, leaving them exposed indefinitely. It took 3 minutes of agonizing labor, hammering the massive steel pins into alignment with the sledgehammer. The clang-clang-clang of metal on metal, a terrifying beacon in the silence between MG bursts. At 7:48 a.m., the pin was secured. The damaged track was functionally repaired, though still lacking the critical Manila rope reinforcement. Track secured, Kovacs reported into his radio headset, crawling back into the turret, coated in grease, oil, and mud. But we are now defenseless against the mud again. We need to secure the far bank and get across this river before we lose traction permanently. He looked at the surviving length of Manila rope still wrapped tightly around the starboard track, the section that had not been hit by the Panzerfaust. It was smoking, strained, but still holding its grip. It was time for the final push. The Germans were regrouping, and Kovacs knew that they would soon target the Kingfisher with everything they had. The only way out of the mud was forward, across the Saar. It was 7:49 a.m., 7:50 a.m. Sergeant Kovacs surveyed the scene from the commander's cupola. The Kingfisher was now running on a patchwork track, shielded by a dead tank, but the urgency had never been greater. German forces were actively maneuvering on the far bank, constructing a hasty barricade near the intended crossing point, a low, concrete bridge still miraculously intact. Roads were going for the crossing. Drive us clear of the wreck. We have 100 yards of deep mud to cover, and then the riverbank. Rhodes carefully disengaged the Kingfisher from the stationary M4A1. The tank rolled forward, leaving the relative safety of the composite shield. The starboard track, still partially wrapped in the surviving Manila rope, gripped the soft earth aggressively. The port track, newly repaired with scavenged steel, immediately began to slip and slide, struggling to maintain traction. Hold it steady, Rhodes. Full power, gentle steering. The Kingfisher struggled through the mud, yawing constantly, demanding every ounce of the driver's skill to prevent a catastrophic spin. The Germans, seeing the tank move again, opened up with renewed machine gun and small arms fire. The rounds pinned off the thick frontal armor, but the real threat was the infantry now massing near the bridge. Kovacs identified 3 German soldiers setting up a heavy MG-42 nest right at the bridge approach, ensuring they could blanket the area with fire the moment any Allied soldier or vehicle attempted the crossing. Malone, he round, high velocity. Bridge approach, right side of the embankment. Take out that MG nest. Malone quickly lined up the shot. The Kingfisher was shaking, the main gun traversing erratically due to the uneven movement, but Malone was an expert marksman. At 7:53 a.m., he fired. The 76mm shell flew perfectly, impacting the concrete embankment right next to the German MG-42. The explosion was sharp and violent, shattering the concrete and scattering the crew and weapon. A crucial obstacle was cleared. But the moment the Kingfisher reached the riverbank, a slight rise leading down to the water, it became terrifyingly clear that the Germans had another defensive measure prepared. The riverbank itself was a sheer, icy slope, strategically laced with tripwires and small teller mines designed to shear off a tank's track assembly. If they lost a track now, they would slide uncontrollably into the partially frozen Saar, ensuring the vehicle sank immediately. Kovacs had to make an instantaneous tactical assessment. Dilemma 1. Option A. Halt and wait for engineers. This meant exposing themselves on the firm ground, a perfect target for long-range artillery, but safe from the river's immediate threat. 2. Option B. Trust the remaining rope. Use the momentum gained from the mud crossing to attempt the short, icy, mined slope and secure the bridge. Kovacs didn't hesitate. Rhodes, full speed over the bank. We are taking the bridge now. He knew that the only reason they had made it this far was the unorthodox engineering solution. The repaired port track would slide immediately on the ice. The starboard track, with its remaining Manila rope, was their only hope for asymmetrical grip. At 7:55 a.m., The Kingfisher crested the bank and slammed onto the icy slope. The tank immediately lost control. The port track spun uselessly on the ice, but the starboard track, its hemp binding gripping the rough ice and the dirt beneath, pulled with agonizing force. The tank slid sideways for 10 feet, miraculously missing the visible tripwires, before the friction of the rope caught hold. The Kingfisher righted itself with a shuddering jolt and slammed onto the flat, concrete bridge approach. They had cleared the kill zone, all thanks to the stubborn, abrasive grip of the thick Manila rope. They were now on the bridge, the only surviving tank in the immediate sector. But the Germans, realizing the crossing was about to be breached, initiated their final, desperate counterattack. On the far side of the river, Kovacs saw 2 German vehicles emerge from the cover of the town, a heavy Sturmgeschütz 3 assault gun and a half-track full of infantry. Their objective was clear: destroy the Kingfisher before it could secure the far bank. Malone, AIF, target the Stu-G. We have company, and they are not waiting for tea. The duel began. It was 7:57 a.m., and the Kingfisher, the Junkyard Dog of the 511th, was the sole lifeline for the entire American advance. 7:58 a.m. The Kingfisher was mid-bridge, an exposed, high-value target exchanging fire with a German assault gun designed to annihilate Allied armor. The German Stu-G3, heavily armored and low-slow, was a formidable opponent. It fired first. A projectile designed for tank killing screamed across the 50-yard gap and impacted the reinforced frontal armor of the Kingfisher with a tremendous, deafening WHUMP. The extra armor scavenged by Kovacs absorbed the hit, but the force of the impact shook the crew violently and momentarily blinded Malone in the optics. Damage report. Kovacs yelled, his ears ringing. Front armor held. That Stu-G hits hard, Sarge. Rhodes responded, fighting the desire to reverse. Malone, focus. We take him out before he reloads. Aim for the gun mantle. AIF. Malone regained his composure instantly. The M4A3E2's 76mm main gun traverse was slow, but steady. He targeted the thick steel shield surrounding the Stu-G's main gun barrel, a critical weak point. At 7:59 a.m., Malone fired. The round slammed into the mantle of the Stu-G3. The APHE charge detonated, and the German gun fell silent, its optics shattered, and its main weapon momentarily disabled. They're burning, but they're not dead, Kovacs reported. The Stu-G was immobilized and damaged, but still a threat, as its crew could exit and engage with small arms or call for fire. Rhodes crossed the bridge. Stop on the far side and traverse right. Malone suppressed that half-track. The German half-track, loaded with infantry, was attempting to flank the bridge, positioning itself to engage the Kingfisher's less protected side armor. At 8:01 a.m., the Kingfisher successfully crossed the Saar. They had breached the line. The remaining tattered Manila rope on the starboard track broke completely upon hitting the rough concrete of the far bank. The tank slid to a halt, the last of Kovacs' engineering improvisations having given its final measure of service. The German half-track unleashed a torrent of fire, but the Kingfisher's turret swung around. Malone loaded an He round perfect for soft targets and fired directly into the vehicle. The half-track exploded in a plume of fire and twisted metal, scattering the infantry. Kovacs had secured the bridgehead. The immediate area was cleared of German anti-tank fire, and the infantry threat was neutralized. The critical moment had passed. Kovacs immediately accessed the functional, but intermittent, radio signal now that they were clear of the deep mud static and transmitted a short, crucial message. This is Kingfisher, 511th Provisional. Bridgehead secured. Far side of the Saar. Heavy armor required immediately. Crossing point is clear. 3 stalled Shermans 100 yards back. Approach is now safe for light vehicles. We are stationary. Track damage severe. Repeat. Bridgehead secured at 8:03. Within minutes, the distant roar of advancing engines could be heard. The rest of the American armored column, which had been waiting hours for the engineers to clear the impossible mud, was now moving forward. The Kingfisher sat immobile, a scarred, mud-caked sentinel at the mouth of the bridge. It had taken 2 hits from heavy anti-tank guns, navigated a geological death trap, survived a Panzerfaust blast, and fought off a counterattack, all thanks to the sheer will and unconventional ingenuity of Sergeant Kovacs and his Junkyard Dogs. But the price of the impossible crossing was evident. The surviving Manila rope hung in shreds from the starboard track, blackened and smoking. The Kingfisher was out of the fight, its mission complete, but its engineering lifespan expended. Kovacs and his crew, covered in sweat, grease, and frozen mud, slumped in their positions. They had secured the crossing 33 minutes late, but they had secured it alone. The roar of the advancing American armor was the sound of victory. It was time for the rest of the army to catch up to the Junkyard Dogs. The story of the Kingfisher's single-handed breach of the Saar River crossing became an instant legend among the American armored divisions. Sergeant Frank Kovacs and the Junkyard Dogs of the 511th were instantly, albeit temporarily, heroes. When the combat engineers finally arrived at 8:45 a.m., they found the M4A3E2 Sherman jumbo, completely immobilized but perfectly positioned, surrounded by the remnants of the German defense. The engineers were immediately fascinated and appalled by the tracks. The sight of the shredded, fused Manila rope wrapped around the starboard grousers, showing signs of severe friction and blast damage, was proof of an unbelievable feat of desperation and engineering. Kovacs confirmed that the rope, intended only to assist with temporary traction, was the sole reason the tank managed to cross the graveyard slope and the mud pit where 3 conventional tanks had failed. Kovacs was later reprimanded for unauthorized modification of military hardware and reckless endangerment of equipment, a standard military formality against the Junkyard Dogs doctrine. But the reprimand was immediately followed by a Distinguished Service Cross recommendation for breaking the German line and securing the crucial bridge. The crossing was secured by 9:30 a.m., and the rapid American advance across the Saar River that day was directly attributed to the early breach provided by the Kingfisher. The cost in human life was minimal for the Allies at that specific crossing point, a direct result of the speed and brutality of Kovacs' action. The Kingfisher itself was towed back for repairs. Its heavy armor, supplemented by Kovacs' Junkyard additions, had saved the crew's lives multiple times. But the legend of the rope tracks the improvised, non-regulation solution that defied physics and military dogma remained the defining characteristic of the mission. It was a testament to the belief that in war, sometimes genius isn't found in a manual, but in the desperate ingenuity of men trained to break rules and survive the impossible. Frank Kovacs and the men of the 511th Provisional Tank Detachment continued their operations, their reputation as the Army's mechanical rebels cemented forever. They were the ones you called when the gear broke down in a way that the manual offered no answer. If this story of technical survival and combat improvisation moved you, don't just click away. Hit like, hit subscribe, and share it with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next untold story from the front lines of World War II. Right now, type a comment with your country and whether your family has any connection to this war. Our community is global, and together we're guarding these memories from being lost. Sergeant Kovacs and his crew did their duty in 1944. This is ours now. Like, comment, and share to keep their story alive. Never forget.